Welcome to EWTN's ongoing series on Humanae Vitae, Pope Paul VI encyclical of human life. Our guest in this program is Bishop Rene Gracida of the Diocese of Corpus Christi. We'll be discussing the doctrinal principles of the encyclical, a very interesting part, really the meat of the encyclical. So please stay tuned. Bishop Gracida, it's a pleasure to be back with you discussing Humanae Vitae, and we're really getting into the heart of the encyclical now when we discuss the doctrinal principles of the teachings of Paul VI. So what exactly are the doctrinal principles on procreation that the Holy Father taught?
The wellspring, the fountain of a principle from which he derives everything else are twofold. First, conjugal love. What is the nature of conjugal love? Obviously, if one starts off with a flawed definition of conjugal love, then one is able to justify a lot of things that would not be in keeping with the traditional teaching of the Church on the subject of the relationship between husband and wife. And secondly, as a result of conjugal love, what are the implications of conjugal love for responsible parenting? What does it mean to be a responsible parent, and what are the responsibilities of parents? So these are the two starting points for the Pope.
Then what does he teach about the nature of conjugal love?
Well, first of all, he situates conjugal love clearly in Revelation. And he says that the origin of conjugal love, of course, is in God, who is love. And it is that love which the Father has, the Creator has, for his children whom he has caused to come into existence, that is, husband and wife, which causes them to relate to each other with God in a way that enables them to truly achieve the purposes for which he placed them here in this world.
That's beautiful, just to situate it in God, the origin in God who is love. That's beautiful.
And again, this is what Fulton J. Sheen, Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, was so fond of saying whenever he talked about marriage, and that is that it takes three to make love. Now, obviously, one has to understand that in a theological context. The people are non-believers and who do not, or atheists who do not believe in God, say, well, they're perfectly capable of engaging in the physical act of love, conjugal love. Mm-hmm. But Fulton Sheen's point was that for marriage, for the conjugal relationship, life together of husband and wife to really be what it is fully capable of being, God has to be a partner in their life mm-hmm. and in their love.
That's beautiful. And so why don't you continue to expand on that?
He then continues to develop the principal characteristics of conjugal love. He says, first of all, this love is human, and therefore both of the senses and of the spirit. And this too is important because, as we know, in our own sensate society, many people have completely eliminated the spirit from conjugal love and deal with it only on the level of sensate pleasure.
Biology, really.
Biology. And whether it's over the team, Masters and Johnson and all of the other sexologists, they seem to be dealing with sex, with the conjugal act, solely on the basis of biology, of the physical relationship, and leaving out totally the spiritual.
The whole spiritual dimension.
The whole spiritual dimension. A second characteristic of conjugal love, Pope Paul says, is that it is total. That is, it is a very special form of personal friendship whereby the spouses generously share everything with each other without undue reservations and without concern for their own selfish convenience. This is the unitive aspect of the conjugal relationship, that it is more than just the union of two bodies, two physical beings in a conjugal relationship, but it is rather through that relationship the achievement of an ongoing relationship in every aspect of their daily lives, so that their relationship is total. It is not merely physical. It is spiritual, mental, psychological, everywhere.
So the physical contributes to the ongoing growth of union in all dimensions.
Exactly.
And it's also the expression of that growing union in all dimensions.
Exactly.
And setting forth the, the principles, what are the consequences then, of when he looks into these things, what are the consequences then when you apply them to the challenge of regulating birth?
Well, he points out that conjugal love, another characteristic of conjugal love is that it is faithful and that it is exclusive. And here too, this flies in the face of contemporary thinking in our secular society, namely that, well, I can remember back, I think it was 1961, watching the David Susskind program. I don't know whether you are old enough to remember the David Susskind program on TV, but he was interviewing two famous personalities in Hollywood, and one of them, I think it was Artie Shaw, said that divorce does not only have a bad character, but that there will come a time in society when divorce will be accorded the same respect that the marriage is. And this was, 61, and this is 93.
Yes.
Obviously, his words had been fulfilled. The other one was Vivica Lindfors, an actress, and she said that that adultery does not only not destroy a marriage, but on the contrary, it will save a marriage.
Boy.
Well,
that's distorted thinking.
and we've come to that. So what Pope Paul VI said in 1968 was that conjugal love, true conjugal love, where it is related vertically as well as horizontally, vertically to God, horizontally to each other, that it is faithful and exclusive to the end.
Okay.
And finally, the fourth characteristic of conjugal love, he says that it is fruitful, that it doesn't seek to just produce pleasure. It doesn't seek to produce just security for the two individuals, but that it is outgoing. It looks to the world. It looks to the community. It looks to the parish, to others, and it looks to them primarily, obviously, in those marriages that are blessed with children, in terms of the new life that it creates.
It's beautiful. It's fruitful in the new life, but also in the outreach of the couple too.
Exactly.
To many dimensions of society around
Yes.
us. Okay. Now, let's apply these principles, at least the nature of the conjugal love, to the whole thing of the challenge of regulating birth. How does he do that?
Well, he says that there are legitimate and not legitimate ways of regulating birth. First of all, he says that if there are if there are reasons to justify large families, if a couple in fidelity to the wish of God does open themselves up to have a large number of children, that is certainly praiseworthy and should be accepted by the world, by society, by everyone, as being very legitimate and given the nature of the conjugal relationship. But he also says that if for whatever reason, because of whatever serious reason, whatever serious reason, whether it be economics, whether it be health, or whatever, a couple determines that they need to limit the size of their family, that also must not be challenged as being wrong. As people would condemn the large family, so people must not condemn the small family a priori. It's just saying that it is wrong.
In which you have to realize that there are serious reasons, or can be serious reasons, why a couple will limit the number of children they'll have.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. He then goes on to talk about the morally impermissible methods of regulating birth. And here, of course, he gets into the whole problem of the contributions of medicine and science, technology, to making it easier and easier. And of course, if it was true in 1968 when you wrote the encyclical, how much more true is it now?
Today, yeah.
You know, when we have not just the anovulin pill, but we have all of these other chemicals, all of these other pills, all of these other devices which make it even easier than it was in 1968 to regulate birth. So he says we must insist again that the direct interruption of the generative process already begun must be totally rejected as a legitimate means of regulating the number of children. Especially to be rejected is direct abortion, even if done for reasons of health. Direct sterilization of the male or female, whether permanent or temporary, is equally to be condemned. In similarly, there must be a rejection of all acts that attempt to impede procreation, both those chosen as a means to an end and those chosen as ends. This includes acts that precede intercourse, acts that accompany intercourse, and acts that are directed to the natural consequences of intercourse. So in condemning the artificial contraception, Pope Paul VI is stressing that it is a comprehensive condemnation, and not singling out just the pill, not singling out any mechanical device or anything in particular, but it is rather the mentality of the individual which wishes to contravene, as it were, the natural process of procreation, which every act of love must be open to if it is to be truly in conformity with God's will and the nature of man. He gets it into the whole question of the principle of double effect. Certainly, it is sometimes permissible to tolerate moral evil when it is the lesser evil, and when one does so in order that one might avoid a greater evil, or so that one might promote a greater good. It is never permissible, however, to do evil so that good might result, not even for the most serious reasons. And Pope John Paul II, in Veritatis Splendor, the new encyclical, clearly teaches the importance of avoiding evil, that evil may never be done under any circumstances when one perceives that it is evil. Yeah.
And I think here he could, in that particular thing about never doing evil to achieve good, some was saying it's okay to practice artificial contraception when in the long run, and looked at the totality, you're going to have a certain number of children. But the Holy Father is saying, in effect, isn't he, that you can't choose to do something evil in itself, artificially contracept, in order to achieve what is looked upon as a good end.
And this is certainly true with regard to, for instance, environmentalists. Environmentalists would say we need to control population in order to preserve the environment. That we're destroying this planet, and we're destroying it through overpopulation. And therefore, it's a good end to preserve the environment, and one means of achieving that is to use artificial contraception. In a similar way, it is argued by some that the good of the individual, the husband, the wife, in terms of enjoyment, the quality of life, again, quality of life, it becomes an end in itself, and defined by different individuals as affluence, pleasure, whatever it may be, so that the quality of life becomes the end as defined by them, and evil means are used to achieve that end.
And that you can never do evil to achieve good.
Never.
The Holy Father calls on spouses in the encyclical to respect the nature and the finality of the conjugal act. What is he saying there?
By the nature and the finality of the conjugal act, he means that it is essentially an act of procreation, and that we can never separate totally that end as a possibility for the conjugal act, so that a couple must remain open to the possibility that if it be God's will, that new life will be achieved. Now, it is legitimate, and certainly Pope Paul VI in the encyclical, as we will discuss later when we talk about the pastoral implications of the encyclical, and he appeals to scientists and to doctors to perfect, as it were, the knowledge which we have about the woman's reproductive cycle, so that as science makes more precise an understanding of the exact nature of the woman's reproductive cycle, couples may with greater certainty engage in the conjugal relationship with the assurance that they will not conceive a child. But there's always the possibility.
And they always have to be open to
and
that.
They have to be open to that possibility. You know, that's the finality. That's the problem when one enters into the conjugal act solely for the purpose of pleasure and completely rules out the possibility, because one doesn't want it, of procreation. Then there is a separation.
And really, Pope Pius XI, in his encyclical on marriage,
yes.
Casti Connubii, he's taught that the two ends of marriage, and therefore the conjugal act, would be to express mutual love and to bring forth new life. And I think that Paul VI is just reiterating that, isn't it? And that both of those ends, which you see from nature, have to be respected and never deliberately thwarted.
I think that's an essential and a very important point. Pope Paul VI built upon the a very important encyclical of Pope Pius XI, Casti Connubii, in which the Pope taught the essential nature of the conjugal relationship as being unitive, that is, bonding together, husband and wife, and also procreative, that is, open always to the creation of new life, if that be God's will. And then also the allocution of Pope Pius XII to the midwives, in which he in turn built upon the teaching of Pius XI. Then Paul VI, and now John Paul II. So here we have 4 popes in our time, this century, teaching the same thing with regard to the nature of the conjugal relationship between husband and wife, the unitive and procreative. And I think that a person would have to really be tremendously daring, almost foolhardy, to set oneself apart from the teaching of 4 popes in our time who have taught so clearly on this subject, and to separate the unitive and the procreative, and say that the procreative is something that we can do away with.
And you know, really, when Pius XI wrote Casti Connubii, he wasn't doing this kind of in a vacuum. He was building on the centuries-old tradition and teaching of the Church.
Absolutely. He did not start from scratch.
He was only responding to the Lambeth Conference, which was opening a door which up to that time had been closed even among Protestants.
In 1930, the Lambeth Conference, as you well say, in 1930, the Lambeth Conference in England shocked the whole Christian world by suddenly, without any warning, approving contraception, artificial contraception.
And it's interesting, they approved it just in very rare circumstances, but it just opened the door. And
they opened the door. In principle, they approved it, and that's what was so disturbing to the Pope.
And what amazes me is that at that time, prophetic voices from within Protestantism predicted exactly what we see today, the sexual revolution, abortion, and everything.
Exactly. One could refer to the domino effect, you know, that once artificial contraception was deemed permissible, then it followed in turn that everything else is permissible, namely sterilization, namely abortion, namely, one keeps on going with regard to the sanctity of human life, now euthanasia. There's no end to it.
Let me go back to something you said, Bishop, about the bonding between husband and wife.
Yes.
Is the Pope's insistence on the procreative value, the procreative aspect of conjugal love, does that diminish his appreciation of the bonding aspect of conjugal love?
Not at all. Not at all. On the contrary, it is when the procreative is reduced in importance or diminished in importance, even to the point of being excluded from the marriage, that the possibility then arises that husband will view the wife as object more than subject, that there will not be the kind of bonding, the kind of appreciation for the dignity of the other. And this same works both ways, of course, for the woman with regard to the man and for the man with regard to the woman. So that the relationship, once it is robbed of that essential element of the procreativity, then enters the danger zone of developing into a relationship which is easily abandoned. And I think that's what we're seeing in our society today, when first of all, well, a recent survey indicated that more than 50% of couples who cohabitate before marriage will divorce. Now, that's a startling statistic, that more than 50% of couples who cohabitate before marriage will certainly divorce. Well, once if they enter marriage, will certainly divorce shortly thereafter. Now, what that says is that when you separate the conjugal act from its procreative end and view it solely in terms of its unitive or bonding end, that bonding doesn't last.
Take place. And you know, the statistics of those who use natural family planning and who therefore are not using contraception, the statistics show that a much smaller percentage of them end up separating or divorcing. So that there's a bonding, and couples have told me that they learn how to express their love in the abstinence periods in other ways that they could have gotten away from if they were always, if the only way was in the marriage act itself.
in the third sector, which we'll talk about later, when the Pope talks about the spouses and the pastoral challenge he gives them, he tells them that their marriage must be characterized by sacrifice. And this is what we see, the difference between couples that are practicing natural family planning and couples that are practicing artificial contraception. In the case of artificial contraception, when the couples have the certain knowledge that procreation is no longer a factor in their lives, then their relationship is reduced entirely to the level of the unity based upon the conjugal relationship. And as we know, it doesn't last because there is not that constant building up through mutual sacrifice of respect for each other and the will of each other. Whereas in natural family planning, that ongoing respecting of the other's desire to maintain a relationship which has a reference to procreation, but nonetheless is not necessarily designed to produce a child every time, results in a bonding which does last and which does grow stronger with the passage of time.
Bishop, to kind of move along a little bit, how do you answer the question of those who say that the conjugal act is essentially a human act, and therefore, as humans, the couple should be able to, to use it as they will?
Again, this brings us back to the idea, so prevalent in our society today, that God does not exist, that God has no role to play in the lives of society or in the lives of individual couples, and that therefore the merely human relationship which exists between husband and wife is one which they can set the parameters to in whatever way they want. This leaving out God, leaves out the natural law, leaves out all of the things which God has said about the ends of marriage and the purpose of marriage. And so if it becomes a merely human relationship, then it is subject to all of the weaknesses which we know that the human being is subject to in his frailty.
Okay. Now let me ask you this. How does the encyclical differentiate between permissible and non-permissible means of regulating birth?
Permissible means would be any means that respect the ends of marriage, namely, which preserve the unitive and the procreative aspects of marriage, and which do not violate any of the moral norms which the Church has taught and is teaching in the present time.
And which therefore don't in any way tamper with the very nature of the act itself. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's open and does not, as the Pope said in the passage which I just read, neither before, during, nor after the act impede or prevent the natural openness of the act to the possibility of procreation.
Okay.
So that the permissible acts would be any act that is that allows that to happen. And certainly the great advances that have been made in our time with regard to natural family planning indicate that it is easier to engage in a conjugal relationship with natural family planning than it is to engage in a relationship with impermissible means.
And really, in natural family planning, the couple is making use of just a greater and greater knowledge of the way God designed the cycles within the woman.
Yes.
Right. It's a very natural thing, really.
Exactly. And what we haven't touched upon is obviously the terrible consequences of the use of some of the impermissible means. We haven't talked about, the terrible forms of ovarian cancer, of uterine cancer. We haven't talked about tumors. We haven't talked about high blood pressure, heart disease. All of these have been at one time or another identified as being an effect of the use of one or another of the different means of artificial contraception.
And not to mention the abortifacient dimension of the pill.
Absolutely.
I think that's something that's not well known.
Even the Dr. Rock's original pill had an abortifacient aspect to it. And certainly now the more modern pills which have been developed do specifically cause abortion to occur.
Basically, as I understand it, if ovulation isn't impeded and if the egg is inseminated, the pill renders the lining of the womb inhospitable to implantation, so that a fertilized egg, therefore a new human being, is sloughed off. And that's the abortifacient aspect of it. And
since the Church believes and teaches that life begins at conception, that is, at the fertilization of the egg, what we have in that process which you've just described is the abortion of a living human being.
Well, thank God the Holy Father, through the light of the Holy Spirit, took the stand he did in this encyclical. Final question for you. Do you think that the Holy Father was being prophetic when he wrote this? Perhaps not everyone will be able to accept a teaching of this sort easily.
Well, he already had the experience of the dissension, the dissent within the commission that he had expanded, which John the 23rd had established, and which he expanded to more than 60 members. And he was well aware, because there were communications coming from within the commission to him privately, he was well aware that there was serious disagreement among some of the members of the commission. And so when he wrote those words in the encyclical, I'm sure that he was being prophetic. He knew that there would be some who would not accept easily the teaching of his encyclical. What I don't think that he anticipated was the extent of it.
Yes. Bishop, thank you so much for this, and I'd appreciate your doing again what you did last time, giving a blessing to our viewing audience.
Very happy to. It's my privilege. May the blessings of Almighty God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit come upon all of you who have been joined with us in this program.
And thanks all of you for watching us and for being with us. In our next program, we're going to discuss the pastoral principles in applying this encyclical. Please join us again in our next program.